Hello to all of you watching online. My name is Jörn Fleck and I'm the Acting Director of the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. It is my pleasure today to welcome you for a discussion on Europe's digital agenda. Digital policy and specifically making Europe fit for the digital age have been a major priority for the European Commission under President Ursula von der Leyen. We've seen major legislative initiatives from Brussels, not only with the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, but also in the area of data governance and artificial intelligence. At the same time, that ambitious digital policy agenda has always been linked to the debate about Europe's digital sovereignty. To its proponents, it's a much-needed step toward European sovereignty. To its detractors, it's a transgression of trade rules to restrict non-European innovators. The impact of Europe's digital agenda and the outcome of the digital sovereignty debate are crucial to the United States as well, not just as a critical ally of Europe during this time of geopolitical confrontation, but also as our economies and developments in the tech space are so intertwined. Europe's digital transformation and tech policies are an area we follow closely here at the Europe Center with our Transatlantic Digital Marketplace Initiative, including with our latest report on Europe's digital sovereignty in practice. I encourage everyone to check out that report, which provides one of the most comprehensive assessments of the digital sovereignty debate. Today, we're here to continue the discussion on the transatlantic digital agenda and take on the idea of European digital sovereignty, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and how the transatlantic relationship can deepen, not divide, our digital and tech approaches. Joining us today is a great group of speakers from the European Commission, the White House, AmCham EU, and the Atlantic Council. Thank you again for joining us for this discussion today. Let me now leave you in the good hands of our excellent moderator, Politico's Chief Technology Correspondent, Mark Scott. Mark, over to you.
Great, thank you for that, and thank you for joining us today, both here, I'm in London, but in DC, Brussels, and wherever else you may be. We're here to talk about Europe, but also about the transatlantic relationship in the US. It seems a pretty crucial time for a lot of these issues, particularly with the European Union moving ahead with its suite of new regulations and how that may affect both the US and elsewhere. Fran, I'm going to turn to you first. As mentioned, the Atlantic Council, you and Ken just published sort of a deep dive analysis of this so-called digital sovereignty. I'm going to assume that anyone tuning in to this event is going to have a somewhat of an idea of what it means. But actually, before I do that, this is supposed to be interactive. So if anyone who's joining us, if you have questions, please put them in the chat function. I would only ask that you say where you're from and your name. We won't be taking any anonymous questions. So with that out of the way, Fran, I just want to get back to you in terms of, can you just give us a quick Cliff Notes version of what Europe's digital sovereignty actually means?
So I think that's an excellent question to start with because it's used in so many different ways. And there is a current debate between digital sovereignty, tech sovereignty, strategic autonomy, and open strategic autonomy. So we could talk all day about that. But I think that what is important is that when we did this report first 2 years ago, all we had was the rhetoric to go on. And what we now have is an extensive amount of legislative proposals and some legislation that's been passed in the EU that kind of shows us what is really meant by this. I do think that we should recognize that the discussion about digital sovereignty comes out of a realization that the EU was a little slow to get started on the digital economy. Even now, we see that the value of the largest digital platforms, if you take the top 100, only about 3% of the value are EU-based companies. So there's still a ways to go. There is a lot of VC capital moving into Europe. But what we tried to do, what Ken Propp and I tried to do in this report, was to break down digital sovereignty and to look at it through 3 components. The first one is financial support for developing EU capabilities. So you have the Battery Alliance, the CHIPS Act, you have Horizon program, you have in the recovery funds, 20% of recovery funds given to the member states is supposed to be digital. The second component is the ambition of having EU standards become global standards. I think this is an inheritance from GDPR, which has in many ways become one of the leading privacy standards around the world. If you look at the introduction to the Artificial Intelligence Act, clearly the same ambitions. And the third area is to make the EU digital economy resilient, if not immune, in some individuals' terminology, from influence or the legal systems of other countries, other regions at all. And to me, this is impossible to do unless you are in favor of autarky. There are ways to restrict investment and to vet investment. I'm very much in favor of investment screening in the geopolitical times that we live. But I think that Europe should be asking itself whether it wants to deal only with EU companies or whether US companies, Japanese companies, et cetera, are also safe enough to deal with. So those are the three components of digital sovereignty that we addressed in the report.
Vern, I'm going to turn to you, and I'm not going to pretend to ask you to speak for all of the European Union, let alone the Commission. But when I talk to your colleagues, both in Brussels and elsewhere, there is somewhat of confusion about what digital sovereignty means. From your perspective, someone who's been involved in many of the regulatory pushes that we've seen within this Commission tenure, I mean, how would you define it? And did Fran sum it up pretty much correctly, or do you have a different definition?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me and speak on behalf of Europe, which of course I'm not empowered to do. Second, also thanks to the Atlantic Council for this really, really good report. I liked it very much when I read it. Probably what I don't like about it is the excessive, in my opinion, focus on digital sovereignty. In a way, I know this can be debated for hours, which part of it may give this flavor. And people would indeed have also in Europe different views of what it should be and how far it should go. But for me, working with Executive Vice President Vestager and having worked on those files before I joined her, it's not the primary objective of our digital policy. We did not set out a digital program to be digitally sovereign, although we mentioned this term somewhere in the documents. We started out with the objective: how can we harness the potential of digital technologies in favor of our companies, societies, consumers, all of us? So it is a pro-digital agenda. And then we set out what are the tools to get there. And the first tool, and you mentioned this, was sort of, well, of course, we have to invest in technologies. If we want to use technologies, data-driven technologies, AI, we want to use the green tech technologies for the Green Deal. We want to have use data in the area of health and so on. We need the connectivity, we need the cloud, we need the computing power, we need AI capabilities and all of that, and we need microprocessors, right? So but that's just one thing. We need those technologies if we want to use them, which does not mean all of these technologies have to be in Europe and nobody else can supply them to us, but we want to have them as well. The second is the legal framework. And here I would really challenge sort of the assumption that creating global norms and gold standards is the key ambition. I was myself one of the fathers of the Digital Services Act in my previous jobs. Believe me, there was none of our concerns whatsoever. We looked into the digital space and we saw all the challenges, no matter what platform they were coming from, in terms of content moderation, lack of transparency, spreading of illegal content, disinformation, manipulation of elections, illegal products coming on our market. It's probably more Alibaba than Amazon, if you want, right? So we were looking in those phenomena and we said, we need to restore trust in this digital environment. Without that trust, our member states don't trust our single market anymore. Without trust, companies and consumers may also not want to engage in this anymore. So most of the legal framework on data, on DSA, on AI is meant to instill trust in these technologies. It's not an anti-American, not even anti-Chinese agenda. It is a sort of the framework conditions for digital technologies to be used in the interest of our people. Last comment on this, DMA, for instance, that's not so much about trust, but that's about fairness and opportunities for everybody. Again, that's not about America or European. It is just that any other company than the gatekeepers, whether they are European, American, Japanese, or what have you, they are all faced with the same problems. And we want an innovative company with a great idea to have a fair chance to survive in the digital world. No matter whether that gatekeeper is Chinese, American, or European, we want a vibrant, contestable market out there. Very last comment promised, US. Of course, we don't want to go it alone. And you're, of course, also all following the TTC, the Tech and Trade Council, which is co-chaired by my boss on our side. And this is precisely because we want to align as much as we can with like-minded countries and nations out there. So there's no way we think or we want to keep this a Europe-only agenda.
Thanks for that, Werner. There's a lot to unpack there, which hopefully we can drill into. But Peter, I'm going to turn to you as we do this first round of questions. From Werner's perspective, this is a benign, open to all initiative to build trust, not to elevate European companies. I would argue to a degree there are many voices within the EU who don't say that. But from the White House's perspective, particularly as someone who's been involved in these Trade and Tech Council negotiations, there's an event in about 3 weeks' time in DC. I mean, how do you, again, as a representative from the White House, view what Europe is trying to do regarding its digital sovereignty push?
No, thank you, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. And I also want to congratulate Ken and Fran and the Atlantic Council on the report released last week. I had a chance to read it over the weekend, and I think it gives a really kind of thorough and thought-provoking kind of typology of what the European agenda is. You know, it's interesting. I think when we think about this from an American perspective, I think in many ways we think about it in some ways the same way that Werner does. We have sort of we see a set of issues that Europe is working through, and we tend to engage on the individual issues rather than sort of thinking about in some ways the comprehensive whole. And I think when we look at the transatlantic digital relationship, you know, first, I think we all begin with a strong view that we have to work on digital issues with Europe. We are the largest economies in the world. We have the bulk of technological leadership across the Atlantic, and so we absolutely have to work together. And I think in many ways, you know, there are things that Europe has done that we actually welcome, and we start with that. For example, I think the U.S. has strongly supported Europe's CHIPS Act. We welcome the kinds of investments that Europe is making to strengthen its technological and innovative ecosystem. You know, I think sometimes we get sort of, there's this view out there that America doesn't want strong European tech companies, and that's just not true, right? There were more unicorns in Europe last year for the first time than in China. You know, it's obviously a hugely welcome development for the US. And so where we see Europe taking steps to strengthen R&D support, to promote entrepreneurship, to have kind of technical tech skills training, those are all really welcome agenda items. You know, I think when it comes to the regulatory agenda, there are many goals that we share with Europe. I think if you talk to President Biden, he would say he shares a view that we should have a competitive tech ecosystem. He has obviously appointed very strong competition policy officials throughout his administration, whether it's Lina Khan over at the FTC or whether it's Tim Wu, my colleague at the White House, doing domestic tech policy. So I think there's a shared vision. That said, it has been troubling to see, you know, certain developments in Europe that look more protectionist than about fostering a competitive ecosystem. You know, so I talked about some of the things we've welcomed, but where we have seen actions in Europe that look protectionist, one that, you know, USTR TIE has been raising recently, for example, around cybersecurity certification schemes that don't really look like they're about strengthening cybersecurity, but potentially look like they may have a protectionist element, and we're going to continue to raise those issues. So I'd say it really is kind of issue by issue as we look at this. There are certain things where I think we are very strongly aligned. There are other areas where we're going to have our differences. That's natural in any bilateral relationship. We're going to talk about those differences candidly. But I want to close by sort of saying where I began. Look, I think from a Biden administration perspective, we understand that in an era of geopolitical competition with authoritarian powers, the US and Europe, along with other key players like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia, have to work together. We have to come up with a shared and common vision that maintains our collective technological edge and that also gives us a vision that we can go and sell into the parts of the world where I think there is much more competition ahead of us.
Thank you for that, Peter. That's a very diplomatic answer, so I appreciate that. I'm going to go maybe to Ken and maybe ask for a less diplomatic answer. So in terms of digital sovereignty, there are some benefits and that have been seen, particularly when it comes to the CHIPS Act, with Intel investing significantly into Germany. But then I look at data localization policy, I look at the cybersecurity issue that Peter raised. There are some friction there. So for those who are tuning in, could you give us a couple of examples of how, for you, the digital sovereignty agenda has manifested itself with specific policies within Europe?
Sure. Our method in this report was to look across a variety of topics, and I appreciate that the European Commission and the U.S. government very much take these one by one. But our role as analysts was to look for the commonalities, and I think if you look at the cyber certification scheme that Peter just referred to, if you look at the Data Act, you see a couple of dimensions that are really striking. One, as Fran mentioned at the outset, is a desire somehow to separate the impact of foreign law from companies that operate in Europe. And a second, as you mentioned, Mark, is data localization. The cyber certification scheme could have the perverse effect through the immunity from foreign law and data localization requirements of actually weakening cybersecurity. So I think there we see a real tension among the goals. And similarly, in the Data Act, which has to do with establishing a comprehensive regulatory regime for non-personal data, everything that isn't personal data or industrial data, as it's sometimes called. There too, there has been seemingly a borrowing from the personal data area, from the GDPR, to create a series of quite substantial safeguards that need to be put in place for international transfers of non-personal data. And that is presumptively in the name of protecting intellectual property, protecting trade secrets, but unless amended in the legislative process, this really has the potential to complicate considerably the very active business in transborder transfers of data.
Thibault, I'm going to come to you as many of your members, the American companies active on both sides of the Atlantic, are affected by the policies that Werner and Peter and Fran and kind of mentioned. It's, for me, a mixed bag. It's not fully protectionist, but it's not also fully open and innovative. Where do you guys sit in terms of how you view this push?
No, I think Mark would take a nuanced approach, and I think that's something that the report actually does very well. If you look at digital sovereignty or strategic autonomy, if it's about creating more resilience in Europe, of course, American companies that are deeply invested in Europe are all supportive of that. Our companies are very involved creating jobs, bringing investment, doing R&D in Europe, and so in many respects are actually supporting Europe's strategic autonomy. And so from that regard, we're supportive of that agenda. Where we are Where we're slightly concerned is on some of the moves that you've just described on cybersecurity. I mean, on standardization as well. If you look at what's happening on at ETSI, the European Telecommunication Standardization Institute, where some of our member companies might have less involvement in the future. Some of those kind of moves are concerning our member companies because they don't recognize their contribution to the European economy. And so I think that's from that perspective that we would be really looking for a continuing of really making sure that the strategic autonomy of Europe is outward looking and recognizes this investment, and also, and importantly, makes a clear difference between a lot of the like-minded partners and the allies. At the end of the day, when we're talking about the Trade and Technology Council agenda, what we're trying to do is basically make sure that the rules of the economy are shaped by basically countries that have the same values, that have a similar outlook on how we create a more resilient, a more sustainable economy. And so that's really how our member companies are looking at that. And when you look at part of the agenda on digital sovereignty, which is making sure that we create a more robust European industry, well, that's something our member companies have been supporting too. If you look at how a lot of our member companies are creating ecosystems around Europe, supporting startups, creating partnerships with research institutions, to me, that's also what ultimately strengthens the resilience of Europe.
But I'm just going to come back to you because, again, it feels a little bit like the panel's ganging up on you. So I'm just going to come back and maybe it feels a little bit we're missing the translation element here, right? Because there's some rhetoric coming from President von der Leyen about putting Europe first, focusing on domestic indigenous technologies and how to foster and develop that. But from what you said, without paraphrasing you too much, it's about innovation, it's about openness, it's about providing that trust. So for our colleagues sitting in DC, there is a disconnect from my perspective. So is that something that you would agree with? And is that just a question of translation or just a misdirection of policy objectives?
First, probably we should still put things into perspective when you talk about the overall digital strategy, all the things that we're doing in terms of investment and research and pro-innovation and legislation and all those different fields. That's an extremely wide area. And now you, of course, you mentioned a couple of things that I know, of course, are very much discussed and disputed, but just to make it clear that this is a part of the ecosystem, right? That's not sort of stands for the European approach towards digital sovereignty. There are a few areas where this debate found its outcome in the way you described, or has not even yet found its outcome, because if you look into the cyber security certification schemes, that's not yet done by the Commission, right? This is still being discussed by the agency together with the member states, and you know what the discussions are about, but that's not yet a European policy. And even that would be non-binding labeling schemes and so on and so forth. I'm not trying to downplay this, but it's not yet done, it's not yet finished, and it's really just part of the discussion. The other comment on the data-related files, Data Act. Of course, we are open and we want to engage with like-minded countries, but it's also the whole notion of those chapters in the Data Act and the Data Governance Act, where we say if there is data that is sensitive to companies, non-personal data, but sensitive, you mentioned IP, trade secrets, what have you, we are not saying that all this data needs to be located in Europe. We are saying if such data is shared, we need to give reassurance to those companies that they enjoy protection of those very rights, and I think which are equally recognized in the US. It's always about sort of this equivalence, that they feel comfortable that it will not someone will remove their trade secret protection because the data cross some border. But to the extent, and as soon as there's any reassurance of real like-minded, partners on both sides of the trade, there's no debate about it. So it is. I think it's half as protectionist as it may sound. I know it's not innocent either, but it's very much part of this trust element. We try to create a data economy. We try to promote data sharing at grand scale across Europe and beyond, if necessary. And for this, we need to have infrastructures. We have to need legal certainty, clarity, trust for companies to be willing to put their data into any such data space in the first place. So that is, again, the driving force is we want more data sharing for this to happen, we need trust in that systems. Otherwise, they're not going to share data. So the starting point is not, once again, we need to have sovereignty and we need to be this, that, and the other. The starting point is we want more data to be shared to be able to use them. And then we're trying to work on the framework conditions. And each of those framework conditions, of course, is open to debate and to disagreement as well.
Thank you for that, Werner. Peter, I'm just going to come to you. It's quite prescient with the midterms yesterday and the ongoing political dynamic playing out in DC. I look over in Brussels and I look at the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Governance Act, the Digital Services Act, the ongoing AI Act, the Data Act, and frankly, too many other acronyms I'd like to mention. And then I look at DC. I appreciate you in the White House, not on Capitol Hill. And, you know, there were a few legislative digital successes, if any, coming out of Washington. So in terms of potentially pushing back against some concerns, legitimate concerns on protectionism on the European side, wouldn't it be useful and helpful if, you know, to create a transatlantic, if not Western alliance on like-minded companies on digital policymaking, that Washington actually got into the game?
So, you know, I appreciate the question. As you allude to, I speak on behalf of the executive branch, not on Congress. That said, I do think the president and other officials across the administration have been pretty clear, going back, frankly, to the 2020 campaign, but, you know, as recently as a month and a half ago, that we would like to see Congress enact privacy legislation, that we would like to see Congress enact legislation to promote a competitive digital economy domestically. Principles, what we think a competitive digital economy domestically should look like about 6 weeks ago. You know, I realize we are now kind of late in this year, but please be assured we are continuing to work with Capitol Hill to see if there is something that we can get done on Capitol Hill. That said, I think you have also seen us take a very aggressive approach under our existing authorities domestically to promote a competitive digital economy, and also to do things like promote privacy. I mean, cases brought by the Federal Trade Commission and by the Department of Justice under longstanding antitrust statutes take time. Investigations take time, but I think you are seeing a number of these cases going through the courts. I also think you're seeing the FTC looking at what it can do under existing authorities to promote privacy. So we really see these in parallel. Obviously, we think ultimately to have the kind of impact we want, whether on privacy or competition policy domestically, Congress is going to have to act. But we have certainly been kind of kicking the tires, as we say, on our existing domestic authorities to see what we can do there. Because I do think it's important for the U.S. To lead in this space, for us not to just kind of look at what other governments are doing and kind of disagree with pieces of what they're doing and agree with others, but to lay out our own affirmative agenda of what we think a smart regulatory policy should be.
Fran, I'm going to come to you and look for some sort of potential successes with the transatlantic relationship on digital. Again, it feels sometimes we get lost in the weeds of differences while remembering that, frankly, 85% of things we agree with. With the Trade and Tech Council meeting coming in DC in early December, where do you see like-minded ability to get things done? I think the CHIPS Act and those subsidies going into domestic production seems like a way that both DC and Brussels can move forward and work together. But where else do you think there's some sort of, maybe not short-term wins, but at least places where there's greater overlap and collaboration than not?
So let me first make one point about EU policymaking, or the way the EU presents itself, and that's that I very much agree with a lot of what Werner has said about the Commission's ambitions, and particularly EVP Vestager's ambitions. But there are others in the Commission, and there are other member states. There are member states who take a much stronger view on digital sovereignty. There are others who take a looser view, a very transatlantic view. So there is sometimes a cacophony of voices, which only confuses the digital sovereignty debate for us analysts, but I think also makes it important to go back to what Peter and Werner both said about the importance of looking at the specific instances and addressing specific instances, because you can go listen to those in Central Europe and those in Paris, and you see a different animal. In terms of success, I think the TTC is going to be meeting in early December here in Washington. I am expecting a couple of agreements, but I think the virtue of the TTC is really the way it can lead to gradual convergence rather than we've signed something and automatically everything changes. So there probably will be, and Peter knows better than I, there probably will be agreements on measuring and evaluating AI for trustworthiness. There may be something on combined funding of ICT in third countries to avoid other countries jumping in there to fund them, that investment. There will be some other things that we are likely to see. But I think one of the telling examples that we're seeing is AI, because we've been doing the TTC now, this will be a year, and we've seen a gradual convergence in the language used by both parties in terms of artificial intelligence. And I would point to the recently released White House Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, I think it's called, which sounds very European, except that it has a lot of disclaimers about how it's not actually legally binding. And I certainly got the impression that a lot of agencies in the US government vetted it and said, this is all nice, but we have to be very careful here. So I do think we have a difference in regulatory climates, structures, ambitions, but I think that we are seeing on AI an agreement about where we want to go. And that is important, and I think we're likely to see it develop in many of the areas where the TTC is working. I've seen, I was on a panel last week where there was a lot of discussion about the Declaration on the Future of the Internet and the more democracy-laden elements of the TTC. And I think we're seeing convergence there about how we try and work forward. The TTC is not supposed to address current legislative files. Obviously, you put the leaders in the room, they're going to talk about these issues. But I think we need to think of the TTC as a way forward, but over the longer term, rather than resolving the specific disputes.
Ken, just going to come to you on the data question. Recently, we had the White House executive order laying out domestic changes that were to meet the requirements from the European Court of Justice in terms of when and how European data can move across to the US. The next step is the European Commission are going to review that. And I hear we might have an adequacy announcement by the end of the year, although TBD. It feels like that, although by no means perfect, is at least an example of the US and Europeans finding a way forward in a very complicated and frankly legally fraught area.
Yes, absolutely, Mark. And I think a lot of credit here is due to Peter and his colleagues in the U.S. government for wrestling this beast to the ground once again. The U.S. government has agreed to a couple of quite significant changes in the way it implements national security law. It has agreed to limit the collection of foreign intelligence to what is proportionate, and that is a European term. It's not clear if it's going to be interpreted in exactly the same way as it is in Europe, but that is clearly an effort to meet the European Court of Justice halfway. And then there is quite an elaborate superstructure for redress of complaints that may be alleged by Europeans about the mishandling of their personal data by the U.S. intelligence community. This involves the creation of an administrative court and the opportunity for individuals to bring their complaints there. after review within the intelligence community itself. This goes far beyond the structure that was elaborated in the previous agreement. And I think there's a real innovative effort that's gone on here to make sure that Europeans will have standing to bring these complaints in a body, before a body that's independent from the perspective of US law. So there's no doubt that this will be challenged again. Some of the reaction in Europe to the agreement has been predictable and disappointing. But I think it really deserves a close look, because there's a seriousness of purpose here. And if a solution, a durable solution, can be found for the transfer of personal data, then I think that augurs well for some of the similar issues that arise in other contexts, for example, relating to non-personal data.
Thibault, many of your members are those companies who now have to comply with these rules if they stand up by the likely legal challenge that is expected. But it feels to me this kind of goes to the asymmetric relationship that we still have. Yes, everyone has the same democratic principles, but in the end, this was a European court telling the US government to change things, to keep the tubes, if you will, to use a very untechnical term, open. In terms of your members, what does that leave you? You've had 2 years of legal uncertainty since that initial case was ruled upon by the European Court of Justice. You have ongoing legal uncertainty with the likely threat of another legal challenge that will then lead to potentially the new deal being overhauled. So where does that leave your members?
Well, Mark, I think we need to be optimistic. I think there was a lot of work that went into it from the US administration side and also from the European Commission. And so, of course, I mean, our members are very supportive of the agreement that was found. And I think we all have to think that that's actually going to be a sustainable mechanism. And no, we just have to wait for the European Commission to issue the adequacy decision. I think what's important in this debate, again, it's to go back to what is the objective, Why are we transferring data? Ultimately, what we're trying to create is to go back to all of the comments that have been made earlier by all of the speakers to create a data economy that is thriving, and where actually we know that between like-minded partners, we're able to do great things together. What was done by the US and the EU here is finding an agreement, trying to respond to the concerns that were laid out, but ultimately making sure that we strike the appropriate balance between protecting the fundamental right to privacy and at the same time making sure that we can enable growth. So our member companies are supportive of that agreement. We're hoping that we're going to get some stability in that area. I have no crystal ball, so I mean I'm not sure I can completely answer your question. But from that perspective, I think it's an important issue, and it's been hopefully addressed. And I'm sure we'll hear more about it in the coming weeks and months for sure.
Unfortunately, Thibault, my job is to be the pessimist, not the optimist, but I appreciate the point. I want to turn, because the discussion is about sort of the transatlantic digital relationship. We have the upcoming TTC meeting. Peter, you're involved in that, and I appreciate you don't want to pretty spill the beans about what's going to be announced, but from my understanding, per Fran's discussion, we'll have at least one, if not two, announcements about ICT development projects in likely Jamaica and Kenya. We'll have stuff around AI, trustworthy AI. We'll have stuff around foreign interference. We'll have stuff more on export controls against Russia in the wake of the Ukraine invasion. But the one thing that still seems a bit uncertain to me is the role that the TTC may play against China. From the White House's perspective, how important is it that no matter what comes up from this transatlantic digital collaboration, a focus has to be in some way on Beijing?
Well, I'd say you do your job well as a journalist, reporting on the TTC. I'm not going to sort of confirm specifics that are going to be announced in just a couple of weeks here in Washington. But I do think it is fair to say one of the goals of this TTC is going to be to kind of make progress on the work streams that we began at the last couple of TTCs on issues like AI, on issues including very much transparency on semiconductor incentives and that kind of thing, where we are both moving forward. And then I do think we have a goal of this TTC of showing that the TTC is not just about the US and Europe, but also about what the US and Europe can do for the rest of the world in a very concrete kind of way. You know, President Biden talks a lot, and President von der Leyen as well, about the need to show that democracies can deliver both for our own people, but also for people around the world. And I think that has been very much on our mind and the mind in Europe. How can we show in kind of a tangible way that we're focusing on the needs of the world as well. On your question about China, look, I think clearly one of the major things we are working to accomplish through the TTC is to set a group of standards and norms in the tech space that are areas we can work together and show cooperation in areas where China has a very different vision, right? And so I think, you know, it is important to us to have agreement on how we think about incentives for semiconductors, because if we don't get agreement between us on that, China's just going to go out and try and win the semiconductor race, right? So that's an area where we have to work together. AI too. I mean, you know, to Fran's point, I think you are seeing a convergence in both Europe and in the US on kind of what the goals are with respect to the regulation of AI. And I think, and I appreciated, Fran, you bringing up the sort of thing that is a sort of aspirational Bill of Rights for AI, recognizing we have a complex legal and regulatory environment, and it is very similar to many of the goals in Europe. So I think you'll see us, you know, try to move forward with some shared standards and principles on that, because China has a very different vision of what AI should do that they're going forward and implementing domestically in China. Very surveillance, very sort of repression-oriented view of AI. So I think that you know, the TTC is about the US and Europe, but it is also about how we can set standards globally in this era of geopolitical competition with China.
Bernard, I appreciate TTC falls to other parts of the Vesta cabinet, and I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but in terms of that transatlantic relationship, it's hard to not look past the world's second largest economy, arguably the second biggest tech superpower beyond the US. And I'm struck by my own reporting how within the EU, not maybe in the Commission, but within the broader EU family of institutions, what to do about China still seems to be an open question.
I guess it will remain an open question even after my response to your question. But generally speaking, I think first of all, we work for Europe and we work with like-minded countries like the US. So I don't see us actively working against another nation or continent, if you want. So we work actively with like-minded, and as Peter just said, if that means, you know, pushing, agreeing on standards in technologies, and in jointly sort of spreading the news on what type of future of the internet we want to see on a global scale, I mean, all of that speaks for itself, right? And many of the other measures that we are taking, when I say we work for Europe, if we want to be resilient, if we want to be more protected against, cyber attacks, if we want not to be confronted with unfair competition with state-subsidized investors in Europe, a lot of that will quite naturally hit some part of the globe more than others, if that is an answer.
I'm going to come to Ken for a question. Thank you for the Q&A that's coming in. One question that comes up, again, I'm going to keep focusing on China just for a second, is the role of data and data being sent from both the US and Europe to China and the concerns about that. Do you think there are ways for both the Europeans and Americans to work on this data question in terms of where the data goes, who has access to it? Are there any sort of abilities or ways for the US and Europe to work more closely on that front?
This is a debate, Mark, that is really just getting underway, I would say. For the last decade, even longer, there has been a sort of a singular focus in Europe on data transfers to the United States. And that, of course, was driven by Edward Snowden's disclosures nearly a year ago, a decade ago, about the extent of US intelligence collection in Europe. But the world is a different place now. And particularly the invasion of Ukraine has brought a focus on data transfers going to other countries besides the United States. We are beginning to see questions asked by European data protection authorities at the national level about data transfers to China. These will make their way into judicial proceedings as well, undoubtedly. And I think that reorientation does create an opportunity for the US and the EU to work together on on this question. You know, I would also mention in this regard that there's a very striking exercise going on in Paris at the OECD on government access to data. And that is soon, we understand, to yield a declaration or a recommendation, a set of principles in any event, that will show the commonalities among Western democracies in how they regulate their intelligence services. I think that achievement in itself will cast a spotlight on countries in the world that don't play by those rules.
Can I come in on this for just a minute? Because I do think there's a real opportunity for the US and Europe to work together to come up with a sort of shared approach to dealing with the data security risks we do face from China. And I think you see some successful precedent that we can build on, right? Over the last couple of years, I think the US and Europe have really converged on what we see as a set of risks around Chinese telecom network infrastructure, right? So we've done a lot of work together to make sure, and it's not been easy because it's expensive and technically complicated, but to make sure that we are using trusted network infrastructure providers in our telecom network infrastructure. But when you look out at the kind of tech ecosystem, well, we're making a lot of progress on, wireline, fixed line, telecom network infrastructure. We're making a lot of progress on wireless, 4G, 5G use of trusted network infrastructure. There's a whole other ecosystem out there, for example, on cloud service providers, right? Where, whatever the differences might be between, how Europe and the US see US and European cloud services providers, that difference is small compared to the risks that come from, say, a Russian or a Chinese cloud service provider, right? So I think there's a precedent that we can build on in the network infrastructure space, where there's been a lot of convergence on what we see as the risks and how we address them. That's long term, but that we can take more broadly to some of the other data security risks we both face from China, from Russia, from other authoritarian technological countries.
Steve, I just want to come to you, building on this part of the TTC discussion. It feels sometimes that industry have some very short-term immediate asks on policymakers, whereas, forgive me, Peter and Werner, sometimes policymakers like to think in more longer-term strategies. In terms of what your members are looking for from the meeting on December 5th, what is a win for you?
I think it's both things, right? I think the December meeting is important because we, or the EU and the US, need to show that the TTC can deliver. And so that's why when we're talking about some of the deliverables that Fran and Peter alluded to, that seems really important for our members. So when you look at emerging technology, what we can do on AI, on cloud, on cybersecurity, on some of the other technologies, that's critical. The work on standardization as well. So how can the EU and the US really cooperate more when it comes to international standard-setting bodies, and even something we haven't actually touched upon today, which is the whole sustainability agenda, and how do we make sure that actually the EU and the US work together on basically unlocking really the potential of green technology and really making sure that on both sides of the Atlantic we can address the climate emergency. And so those are, I think, whether it's a short or a long-term win, I'm not sure, but I think those are things that our member companies would like to see. And to go back to Fran's comment on the fact that indeed it will be challenging, and potentially we're looking at more kind of long-term and more vision with the TTC. I think you need to do both, because you also need to build momentum. You also need to create buy-in from industry, but not just from industry, from civil society on both sides of the Atlantic, and you need to demonstrate that the TTC is not just an important tool because you can think about the future, which is important, but also at the same time a tool that actually brings concrete results that we then need to explain to the public. Something I find interesting is how, for example, the work that's been done by the TTC on export controls that was critical to the swift response, united response from the EU and the US to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to some extent, that story isn't really out there. I'm not sure that many people, including, and I was at even recently with people that are in the policy sphere, I'm not sure the story is out there that the TTC and that working group is actually critical to the response that came from the EU and the US. So we also need to do, all of us, a better job at actually telling that story, and at the same time making sure that there is a bit of a sense of urgency in terms of the deliverables that can come out of the TTC. And one final point I would make, and it's not going to surprise you, is that of course industry is willing to be involved. I think we've seen recently attempts by the EU and the US to create more sustainable mechanisms for stakeholder engagement. I think we need to continue to do that, because when we're talking about emerging technology, when we're talking about standards, when we're talking about supply chains, I mean, you need the expertise of industry, and the companies are actually experiencing those issues to be able, I think, to create robust mechanisms. Mark.
Thank you.
Could I make a couple of points on the TTC?
Please.
First off, along with it being something where you can look at convergence on ambitions for certain technologies, it's creating a group of officials on both sides of the Atlantic, including in technical agencies, who are on the working groups together and getting to know each other. And this was in part responsible for the success on the export controls working group that Thibault has just mentioned. But I do think, since we are talking on the day after an American election, there will be another election in 2 years. And if we want, and there'll be a European Parliament and a new Commission by that time. And if we want the TTC to survive that transition, then there needs to be really strong stakeholder engagement and arguments that it should continue to go forward. Even if we go to a new Democratic administration, even if President von der Leyen should be reelected, I think there are going to be people who are asking questions, and so we need to make sure about that. I also wanted to just go back to something that Peter said about the EU working with how we both need to work with like-minded countries. It seems to me, legally, the EU often distinguishes between EU and non-EU companies, and we do the same, Buy American, et cetera. And we need to figure out a way that we bring companies from like-minded countries and companies that are trusted vendors into this magic circle, if I can call it that, and figure out a way to do that together. And I think that it's the US and the EU that need to be responsible for starting that conversation about how we do that. I don't know how many lawyers it would take to figure this out, but I do think that we need to start to figure it out now.
Brian, I think you make a very valid point about the 2024 election, and particularly with the ongoing flux in Capitol Hill and who may not run for the presidency in 2024. I think it's key to see if the TTC will even survive that. I'm conscious that we've asked Werner to kind of explain Europe in multiple ways, and so I'm going to give him an opportunity. Again, because a lot of this is about, well, Europe is doing X or Y. From the Commission's perspective, or even your personal perspective, what would you want your counterparts in DC to be doing in terms of this? Again, we talk about like-minded governments working with each other. We talk about greater collaboration. But from the Commission's perspective, what would you want either the White House, the agencies, or even politicians on Capitol Hill to be doing that could help with what you're doing in Brussels?
But I think everything we're doing today and what we're doing and have been doing in the context of the TTC is already so important for that very reason. I agree with the previous speakers that we need deliverables and show success and this, that, and the other, and all of this will happen, But I would also agree with the statement about export controls and that this wouldn't have happened at the same speed and with the same quality had those trustworthy structures between ourselves not been in place, and you know whom to call and whom to talk to. And this applies, I think, to the entire tech agenda. Just look into all the working groups and the topics covered. I think we're building so much at least understanding of each other's positions that we can eliminate. There will always be disagreements. Don't get me wrong. We'll always find areas where we just don't agree, which is normal. It happens in the best of marriages. But at least discussions should not be based on misunderstandings. And when we discuss, as we did today, data, the more complicated things like cyber certification, data, DMA, and so on, that at least there's a perfect understanding on both sides why we're doing this, what we're doing, what we could be doing together, where we may not agree. And that's already the first thing, right? That we're all ready to keep talking, to exchanging notes, to discussing, to be honest with each other. What are the motivations? What are we doing? What can we do together? I think this is all I would be asking for at this stage. I would just give another last example, as Peter already mentioned on AI. It's a very good example. We don't even have to agree to legislate in the same way. We already agreed a long time ago how you can manage, how you can achieve trustworthy AI, all the principles from data quality down to human in the loop. We all know what we're doing. We agree, we focus on high risk. Now we will also be agreeing at some stage on how to measure and evaluate all of that, both the risk and the systems and the risk management systems and so on. We'll talk the same language, we will develop the same tools, we will base ourselves on the same standards. In essence, de facto, we will be jointly defining how AI should be deployed in our societies. That's a major achievement without even hundreds of lawyers having to find common laws for us.
I think on that optimistic note, I'm going to thank the panelists for being so open and frank with the discussion. It feels an ongoing mistranslation or about what both sides are doing. I get your point, Werner, in terms of the policymakers sitting around in those working groups at the TDC, but I think still, as someone who spent a lot of time looking at this issue, there's a view that Europe is always protectionist and America is only in favor of the companies, which I think is both binary and a little bit too simplistic. I think both sides hearts, if that's the right way to put it, in the right place. It's just a question of how you operationalize that with the very different structures in place. To Thibaut's point, I would add humbly that anyone who reads my Digital Bridge weekly newsletter would have known about the export controls. So I would ask you to sign up because I have to be a little bit selfish in my request. But with that, I just want to say thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for organizing this event. I would highly recommend reading Ken and Fran's briefing note. It is exhaustive in the most best way possible. So with that, thank you, and thank you for tuning in.